Jan Delcour is a full professor in food chemistry at KU Leuven in Belgium and leads a team that are working on cereal science and technology. His research focuses on generating basic insights into the starch, non-starch polysaccharides, lipids and proteins in cereals, as well as plant and microbial enzymes, converting the structure and properties of these constituents. At the same time, the team is applying insights in cereal-based biotechnological processes to develop and optimize processes, develop the production of health-promoting constituents, and contribute to the final organoleptic properties. Jan is a highly cited author. He is the inventor or co-inventor of more than 20 patent families. He has received several prestigious national and international commissions and prizes for its teaching and research excellence. Today Jan will talk about tailoring structure and properties of wheat constituents for improving the quality of cereal-based products. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Per, for this very kind introduction. Yes, today I'm going to talk about tailoring the structure and properties of wheat flour constituents for improving bread quality. As you see, I'm from KU Leuven. Our university was founded in 1425 already, so we're one of the oldest universities in Europe, I would say. Prior to doing so, I cannot stress enough how humbled and honored I was to have received with Professor Chiang the Bertebos Prize from the Bertebos Foundation. Came as a surprise. It was really perceived as a great honor. We had a very nice ceremony, as Per already said. So, and of course, in my particular case, it would not have been possible if Per, whom I collaborated with in the 90s and then later within the health grain project, if he would not have nominated me. So thank you very much, Per. Scientific career is not possible if there's no strong woman behind a man. So my wife here, Sabine, of course. Also very grateful that those of you whom I helped to invite took up the invitation, and I put down the list so I wouldn't forget any name, because that would be Charlotte, of course, Elke, Bruce, Hubert from EFSA, and then Professor van Vladen from Unilever also. Unilever, Nestle, of course. How could I say that? Then, of course, we have a whole team of the Lab of Food Chemistry and Biochemistry, which I lead. I am also very indebted to Professor Hosany. He's in his 80s, but he was the person who introduced me to cereal science and technology in the late 80s. Then IWT, FWO, KU Leuven, that's where a lot of our money for research comes from. We have industry partners. We'll see that a little later as well. And then the Kellogg Company has donated a chair for a total period for 10 years. So, and that's a pure donation, so that is very much appreciated as well. Let me go into the topic, tailoring the structure and properties of wheat flour constituents for improving bread quality. We see there are a number of things. The structure of wheat flour constituents, I need to say a little about that. Properties of wheat flour constituents, and then what can we do, how can we tailor? So that will be sort of the guideline for the talk. Prior to doing that, I'm going to briefly say something about how do we convert wheat into wheat flour, what is wheat flour, what are its constituents, what happens with these constituents in bread making, how can we tailor the structure. And I have, taken an approach. There's a lot of people with meat experience here, there's a lot of people in the cereal area, so I have tried to give some essentials of bread making as well for those part of the audience I will assume, is not so familiar with bread making as a process. Okay, let me first go from wheat to wheat flour. This is the endosperm, the white tissue which you see when you break open a wheat kernel, and you see starch granules and you see some protein attached to it. And first thing is that the endosperm in the more soft wheat cultivars is different from that in the hard wheat cultivars. So this is a picture of wheat, different types. What we do, and tomorrow there will be a visit to the mill of the Berthe Group. We will see that wheat flour is produced by roller milling, which is essentially separation of the white tissue from the outer layers. And flour yields are typically about 72 to 75%. That would be typical yields. And you see the particle distributions here. You see 364 on the extreme right, and then soft wheat fractionates in a different way from hard wheat. And anyway, flour is a product which is sieved on 129 micrometers typically. So any smaller direction in one way will make that the flour will pass the sieves. What are the wheat flour constituents? Well, I'm not going to talk about all these constituents, but typically wheat flour contains about 70% of starch, so that's the main constituents. Protein, 12% typically. Non-starch polysaccharides, we talk about dietary fiber. In a typical wheat flour, only about 2%. Lipids, 1.5 to 2%. And then water. I'm not going to talk about lipids. I was fortunate that Charlotte, and it just happenstance that I decided yesterday not to talk about lipids. So she talked about it this morning, so that's all in order then. Starch, a function, it's a reserve polysaccharide, so the wheat kernel makes starch to bring the plant to the next generation. The wheat starch is sort of particular. It has two size distributions. It's not unimodal. You have two groups of starch granules. One is 2 to 10 micrometers, the other one is 20 to 35. So you can see larger and smaller granules on the picture. They're round, they're lenticular, depending on the dimensions. What is starch made up? Starch is made up of amylose and amylopectin. Typically 25% amylose in wheat starch, typically 75%. But it's just a glucose polymer. So starch is a glucose polymer. We look at it that way. You may think that amylose is less important than amylopectin because it's 25 versus 75%. It's maybe premature to say so. When you look at amylose, it's a smaller molecule. It's essentially linear. It has about 2,000 glucose units per molecule, and it can complex some lipids. We were talking about emulsifiers. Here's a free fatty acid complex in a helix of amylose. In the wheat kernel, this polymer is amorphous. When I go to amylopectin, this is highly branched. It's very large. It has about 500,000 glucose units. Nobody really knows. How do you measure in that size range? So we have about 500,000 glucose units. Linkages 5%, alpha-1,6, 95% alpha-1,4. So the average chain length you can guess would be about 20 if you take those ratios. Heavily branched, and it's both amorphous and crystalline. So one notion, here's what we assume to be the structure for amylopectin, all small branches, and we make distinctions between different of these branches. But short branches, it's like a tree, whereas amylose would be a short branch. We consider that to be rather a tree. And starch is a semi-crystalline entity just because of the amylopectin. So starch has some crystallinity to it, and that's due to the outer chains in the amylopectin fraction. Because it has order, it's birefringent. Here's a picture of starch under polarized microscope. I said already 75% amylopectin by weight, 25% amylose by weight. But if we assume like 500,000 glucose units per amylopectin molecule versus 2,000 only for amylose, you would see that we would have about 80,000 times more amylose than amylopectin molecules in starch. So amylose, even if it's only 25%, is certainly something which is very important in the behavior, because we have 75% of smaller molecules mobile. If I want to understand wheat flour, I also need to say something about the proteins. And the proteins are fractionated. This is a scheme devised in 1907 by Osborne. It's still used today. It's still used in our lab. It's used elsewhere. Some modifications to the original method. And the minor fractions are albumins and globulins. The prolamins and glutellins make up about 80% of the protein. And they're either extractable in 70% ethanol or in dilute acid or dilute base, and then that would be the glutenin. And when we talk about gluten protein, it's really the sum of the prolamin and the glutenin, and they're present in about equal quantities. Maybe gliadin is monomeric, small protein. It has intramolecular disulfide bridges. There's different types. And what's very unique about gluten, gliadin, both, and glutenin is that they contain high levels of proline and glutamine. The sum of those two amino acids make up about a little less than 50% of the protein, which makes that the conversion factor in Kjeldahl analysis, whereas in many instances it's 6.25, in this particular case it's only 5.7. And gliadin and glutenin together form gluten. And the glutenin is a large molecule. We don't know how large it is. It's composed of high molecular weight glutenin subunits, and it's composed of low molecular weight glutenin subunits in a different in different ratios, 15 to 85, different molecular masses. They form intramolecular disulfide bonds, and Charlotte has given some picture of that. Again, high levels of proline and glutamine, N times 5.7. So it's the intramolecular at the level of the subunits, but then intramolecular at the level of the glutenin disulfide bonds that link all these subunits together. And we don't know how many subunits are linked to each other, and we even don't know how they're linked. So that's extremely difficult. The only way to study this further is to release them by reducing agents. And here's an old picture which I have from the internet. Gliadin in water, that's what it looks on the left. Glutenin is what you see. It doesn't flow, you can stretch it between your hands, that's glutenin, and the two together make gluten. So gluten is about half of each. I'm moving to the next category of flour constituents, only about 2%. And we talk about non-starch polysaccharides. We talk in normal wheat flour about the dietary fiber fraction, non-starch polysaccharides. And there's little beta 1314 D-glucan there, little, typically 0.2%. There's an arabinogalactan peptide, 0.3%, which is quite constant. We don't really know what it does there. But the major fraction would be your arabinoxylan. Arabinoxylan is something that we invested a lot of efforts in over the years. Ben knows that. These are the arabinoxylans, xylose backbone, A. In B, a xylose unit to which an arabinose is attached, so we talk about arabinoxylans. And then we have them substituted at position 2, at position 3. And we also have 2 and 3. And we also see some ferulic acid attached to the arabinoxylan, which is an antioxidant and can contribute to the properties of the arabinoxylan, be it that it's only present there in minute amounts. What we did is, over the years, we looked into the structure of these water-soluble arabinoxylans, water-extractable arabinoxylans. Some are water-extractable, some are water-insoluble. I'll come to that in a little while. And what we saw, based on the use of NMR, and Perelman's group has done work in this area as well, we could see that there's different ratios of the different between cultivars. The average arabinoxylan looks different in terms of mono substitution of the xyloses, dye substitution, and the like. What we also noted is that when we went to one particular wheat flour, again, you could see that the water extractable arabinoxylan population within a cultivar is really a collection of different molecules. You can fractionate them. They do not only differ in molecular weight, but they also differ in their substitution pattern of the xylose. In essence, what we can say here is that there's two forms, water unextractable arabinoxylan. They make up about 2/3 to 3/4. So typically we say 1.5%. They're linked to cell wall components. They're part of the cell wall. They have strong water holding capacity. And we also have the water extractable arabinoxylan, which makes up about 1/4. We typically say 0.5% on flour basis. Their structure is similar, but they're water extractable. They're susceptible to oxidative gelation because of this ferulic acid. This is on the identity of the players that we're going to discuss. I'm going on this particular because it was a decisive element in this Bertha-Bus competition. I'm going to sort of show what we have done over the years in the arabinoxylan. So what a first building block was the isolation and characterization of arabinoxylan in cereal grains. I'm going to come back to that later with timelines evolving towards the bottom. Let me talk about what these wheat flour constituents do in bread making. And when we make bread, the first thing we do is we make a dough. And the first question you can ask yourself, what happens to the starch when I make dough? Well, not much. When I add water in the system, I need water, I need flour, I need a little salt, that's the minimum formula. Not much happens to the starch. Starch will take up some water. It will swell very slightly. Basically what we say is that there's channels out there, there's voids in that structure, semi-crystalline starch, some amorphous, some crystalline, and it just fills up the voids, and that's what happens. It's different with the damaged starch. When I do milling, whether I want to or not, and I want to some degree, I will damage some of the starch granules. And when they're damaged, they rather behave like gelatinized starch, and they will take up a lot of water. The damaged starch will, not the native starch. If I take the native starch and I put it in water and I dry it gently afterwards, nothing has changed on the starch. So that's reversible. Damaged starch is a different story. So when I make dough, native starch will swell slightly. And this is a picture or a figure taken from one of our papers in which we look at the whole chain on what happens with starch if you heat it and then subsequently cool it. But that picture is for excess water, not necessarily valid for bread making. During baking, what happens is that the starch, while you take a dough, it's different from bread. You take a slice of dough, you cannot blow through that. If I take a slice of bread, I hold it in front of my face, I can blow air through it. So I have fundamentally changed the structure of that thing. What happens is that starch gelatinizes in baking. It swells, it loses its birefringence, its crystals melt, so I'm going from starch which is semi-crystalline, and now my starch is totally amorphous. I don't know how much amylose leaches out of those granules. I don't know that. There's some reports that say, real proof, I don't know. There's swollen granule remnants, and the viscosity of that system increases. Let me go to this figure. Why do we say amylose leaches? Let's look at this starch granule in baking as a collection of amylopectin molecules, as a collection of trees in the forest. And then I have these branches, amylose, linear, smaller pieces. Cut a tree in the forest and try to pull it out. It's not going to work. You're going to hit other trees. It's not going to work. Who can swim out? the amylose molecules. If they can do it, it's going to be them. They're small, they're linear. So we talk about granule remnants. So it's all this amylopectin that's interfering with its own mobility, I would say. I'm now going to cool my bread. I have baked, I'm going to cool my bread. What do we know about a bread which, those of you who bake bread and who have bread at home, can you slice a bread when it comes out of the oven? No, you cannot. And why is that? Because there's no structure there. What happens when you take the bread out of the oven, in a short time frame, amylose crystallizes. So by the time your bread goes from 100 degrees C, that's the maximum temperature in the oven, to room temperature, what happens there is that the amylose crystallizes. And that gives structure. And that makes it that your bread you can crystallize it. In a longer time frame, amylopectin outer branches will crystallize and retrograde. And that will be responsible for the loss of the texture, the soft texture of your bread in time. So what we say during cooling, we have amylose crystals which form, and during storage also amylopectin crystallizes. Interestingly, the amylose crystals have melting temperatures above 100 degrees C. The amylopectin crystals have melting temperatures 45 to 60 degrees C, and that's why you can toast the bread. If you toast the bread, you will make it soft again. I mean, the outer will, very outer. If you have thick slice, well, the crystals will melt, and then the texture will become soft again. I'm storing my bread, the crumb firms, we know that. It loses resilience, it loses its elasticity. What we know is that there's crumb to crust water migration, so the crust becomes leathery, water goes there. Water is immobilized also as a result of the amylopectin crystals. Amylopectin crystals take up a lot of water, much more than the original crystals which were in the bread. And starch withdraws water from the gluten phase, and the gluten was responsible for viscoelasticity. So gluten, if I move to the next, that was the role of starch. Forms during dough mixing. It's responsible for dough viscoelasticity and gas holding capacity. Here we have the gluten again. Gliadin viscosity, elasticity is the property for the glutenin. Gluten quantity, concentration, and quality is very important. There's good wheat cultivars, there's poor wheat cultivars. And a lot is linked to the composition of the high molecular weight glutenin subunits. Glutenin size, of course, is very important. And also important is that during baking, the gluten polymerizes. And that's sort of the starch and the gluten brings me to networks in dough and bread. Networks are needed for the coherence of dough and crumb. They can be temporarily transient if the molecules entangle. They can be permanent as a result of covalent linkages being formed or partial crystallinity. In dough, the networks are transient. They consist of amylose and amylopectin from damaged starch. Glutenin is not permanent, it's not thermoset at that stage. And gliadin is rather globular, so it does not entangle. I have baked my bread fresh. Gelatinized starch is entangled, so they give structure. The glutenin network is permanent already. It's thermoset. And during the baking process, we found that some gliadin is incorporated in the glutenin. So the monomeric proteins move into the polymeric network. When the bread is cooled, I have an amylose network. That gives my structure, that makes my bread sliceable. In the stored bread, it moves further. Amylopectin crystallizes, and it contributes to the network. Okay? After a while, I have lost water to the amylopectin. Water is withdrawn from the gluten phase, and that makes gluten less plasticized, and that also contributes to loss of resilience. So we have breadcrumb firming and loss of resilience. The arabinoxylane, 2%. We have a handy technique, and this is based on the doctoral work of Christophe Courtin from my group, about 10, 12 years ago, I would say. What we did is, you can take flour and you can fractionate it in the lab, into starch, gluten, water extractable arabinoxylane, and water unextractable arabinoxylane. Then you throw it all together. And if you do that right, you get exactly the same loaf of bread. What we then did is, we once took out the water unextractable, forgot to put them back in. You get a bread with a much higher volume. You double the quantity of the water unextractable arabinoxylane, you obtain a brick rather than a bread. You take the water extractable, you double their concentration, it's slightly better. So here, what we learned is that water unextractable arabinoxylanes are very deleterious in bread making. So that already gives some ideas on what to do with xylanase technologies. So this was a time where we collaborated on this topic with Piratos. We not only looked on this process, but also on gluten starch separation, industrial as a different process, amylum and the like. So that brings me to the core. What can we do? Tailoring the structure and properties of wheat flour constituents. What can we do? Well, let's first look at amylases. Amylases in bread making. And first I want to discuss wheat alpha amylase, then wheat beta amylase, and then we have done some work on some different enzymes, but here I will limit myself to maltogenic amylase. I'm going to talk a little about that. Alpha amylase is an endoenzyme. It cuts the starch, so it really reduces the molecular weight because it cuts endo, in the middle of the molecule. It doesn't cut, it doesn't trim like your barber would do. It really goes in the core of the molecule. In a good sound wheat flour, it's not active because it's not there. It's an enzyme which ideally, which is formed during germination. In years where we have pre-harvest sprouting, you would have this amylase. You can tolerate a bit, you cannot tolerate a lot. So it's absent in sound flour. It generates maltose for fermentation. It reduces viscosity during starch gelatinization. When used correctly, it can increase the volume, limited levels. Alpha amylase would have anti-firming effects, but if you look at the bacterial alpha amylases, it will, in many instances, lead to poor crumb resilience. And you can use malt, external then, malt enzymes, fungal enzymes, or bacterial enzymes. Wheat has beta amylase. Beta amylase is an exoenzyme which works from the non-reducing ends. There's tons of beta amylase in sound wheat flour, tons of it. Nature has really foreseen that when the kernel germinates, alpha amylase is formed, and wheat beta amylase is waiting there for the alpha amylase to start its action so that the beta amylase can support that action. Luckily, in bread making, it's not active. And why is it not active? It doesn't work as long as the starch is not gelatinized, as long as a certain temperature is reached, and it's inactivated before it could do anything. So beta amylase in wheat flour, very little impact, a little impact on the damaged starch, but that would be all. In industrial practice, the bread which you purchase is treated with anti-firming amylases. And the ideal anti-firming amylase is one which is not inactivated before starch gelatinizes. It should not be active before starch gelatinizes. It would only be active after starch gelatinization. What I'm saying is once the structure is set, because starch gelatinization is a very important component in the setting of the structure. Ideal amylases, of course, lead to soft crumb structures, resilient crumb structures by ensuring water retention by the gluten. There's such an enzyme available. It's sold in the market as Novamil. It's mainly exo action, so it really will not affect the structure very much because it only cuts from the outside. It's not going to reduce the molecular weight drastically. Mainly exo attack and releases maltose. Here's some work from our group. You have a control bread and you add a bacterial alpha amylase, and what you see is that the crumb structure of that bacterial alpha amylase treated bread is different. What tells me that it has been active before the structure is set. Otherwise I would not change the structure. Novamil, look at the control, hardly discernible. So it waits until the structure is set and then it can do its trick, which is quite a success. If you take other endoamylases, they're less efficient than this one would be. So Novamil, we studied that extensively. The strange thing about Novamil, but I don't have time to go into that, is that its action pattern shifts with temperature. It goes from mainly exo, and at higher temperature it also has some endo action. And again, because that endo action is then only when the structure is set, we assume that that presents little problems. Here's some NMR work that we have done in this area. What you see when bread ages is that amylopectin crystals form, and you have an increase in the level of rigid protons as a result of that crystallization. You have strengthening of the networks, loss of water, and look at that size of the increase there, control bread, that arrow at the peak in FID, and then look, dehydration of the gluten network is seen also. But if you add this montogenic amylase, you have much less of that effect. So it makes the amylopectin recrystallization difficult because it has removed maltose units from the chains. Okay, what else can we do? And Charlotte touched on that. We can use emulsifiers in bread making. One which is commonly used is, well, both are commonly used, glycerol monostearate and sodium SSL, stearoyl lactylate. Once they complex amylose does not behave as it would if it were uncomplexed. And that then has an impact on the sliceability of your bread, on the initial firmness of the bread which you make. Charlotte also said something about gluten. Gluten disulfide bonds are very important in the structure. You can, when the gluten is too tough, you can add reducing agents like glutathione, a small molecule. It will exchange its hydrogen with polymeric gluten, and you will lower the average molecular weight of the gluten. You can go the other way. Charlotte talked about potassium bromate. We can talk about ascorbic acid. The dogma says that gluten interacts with glutathione to form this complex, and that ascorbic acid will be active in the process by, well, actually, let me completely explain it. Flour has some free glutathione. Flour has this polymeric gluten. When I make a dough, what will happen is that the gluten will react with the glutathione, and the average molecular weight of my gluten, because glutathione is so small, will become lower. Typically in bread making, I will add 50 ppm, 30 ppm ascorbic acid. Ascorbic acid with endogenous enzymes will be oxidized. Ascorbic acid is really a reducing agent, but with oxygen it will be oxidized, and then it will oxidize glutathione, so that glutathione can no longer have the negative effect on the molecular weight of the gluten. Cysteine can be used like glutathione as well. I'm coming back to my beloved arabinoxylane. They're water unextractable or they're water extractable. Based on the work that Christophe did, our assumption was that if we were to be able to use xylanases here, that would convert these arabinoxylanes to soluble molecules, that we could prove that these would have a detrimental effect on the load volume. If we do away with these, we would form these and that would have a positive effect on load volume. And that's exactly what we did. What we did is we developed an assay in which we took different xylanases and we determined their affinity for hydrolyzing soluble or hydrolyzing insoluble arabinoxylanes. And the learnings was that some xylanases really have an affinity for the water unextractable, much more than for the water extractable. So you give the same enzyme, you give this enzyme, and it's going to very specifically, almost specifically, I should say, hydrolyze the water unextractable and leave these extractables intact. And then you have, at the other end, this Aspergillus aculeatus enzyme, which will exactly do the opposite. And there's a number of enzymes in between. So what we did is we looked at this, and we worked with a number of these enzymes. And yes, we were very clearly able to show that just don't name a xylanase a xylanase. A xylanase is good or bad in bread making. Here, Bacillus subtilis is very good because it destroys this. Aspergillus aculeatus is not. So what we found is that there is such a thing which we defined as endoxylanase substrate selectivity, and that this substrate selectivity defined its functionality. Endoxylanases, we said, are beneficial if they lower the level of the water unextractable, leave the water extractable intact, and they perform less or not if they do the opposite. There was something particular here. Some of these enzymes, and we didn't understand that here, that we would expect would do something in bread making, and normal dosages didn't do a thing. And we didn't understand that. And then we had some very unexpected finding. And the finding was that we were, I'm from Leuven, capital of the beer production in the world, AB InBev today. And we were doing a project on beer making. You know, we had all this experience on the arabinoxylanes and, well, wheat beer, the white beer, typical Belgian product. We said we need to know if we add barley malt, it has all these enzymes, what is it going to do with wheat as an adjunct? So in the production of the Belgian white beer, quite a bit is wheat. And what we did is we made beer, we made wort, and the intention was to see how do these xylanases here, how do they degrade the wheat arabinoxylanes? So the student does this experiment and he comes back and he says, it doesn't work. And he goes, I said, why doesn't it work? Well, he says, you know, I find the same arabinoxylane population from wheat, I find it back here. Nothing happens. And yet, in vitro, I measure that this barley malt has a lot of xylanase activity. So I tell him to do it again, and he comes back with the same result, and I say, well, what you do now is you take wheat extract, and you add it to barley malt, but you do this before and after boiling. And he says, well, when I boil this, then my barley malt can still do the trick. So I go, there must be something like a xylanase inhibitor on a Friday afternoon. He comes back on a Monday morning and he says, there's no such a thing as a xylanase inhibitor. And I go, why? Well, he says, I didn't find it in the literature. So I said, now, that now is really interesting. So we looked into that further, and we identified this inhibitor and we called it TAXI, triticum aestivum xylanase inhibitor, and we did massive amounts of work on that. And massive amounts of work, and before really going into it much further, what we said is, well, let's see what it does in bread making, this concept. So we purified this, and under A you would have control bread, and we added some of this purified taxi from wheat, and you see that the volume of the bread was decreasing slightly. If we had this Aspergillus niger xylanase at high dosages, we could produce this. At normal dosages, not. So really, degradation of the water inextractable, so the enzyme was active compared to this. And then when we added the taxi plus this, the effect was done again. So we said, well, xylanase functionality in bread making must be impacted by these inhibitors. And that was sort of the start of a large research program. We went all the way to crystallization of this protein. We produced a recombinant protein. I'm not going to go into details here. We produced this crystalline protein. We complexed it with xylanase. Here's the xylanase. So the inhibitor is about 40 kilodalton. The xylanase is about 23 kilodalton. And of course then, and I left some pictures out, we could see where the active site was and how they interacted with each other. When you have a variant of this this is an inhibited xylanase bacillus enzyme. This would be the volume increase in bread. This one has to deal with the taxi with much lower quantities of the enzyme. If it's not inhibited, we got better results. So that was sort of quite interesting. And I think made people think differently about xylanase functionality, arabinoxylan functionality as a whole. So here, in this whole track, I would say we patented this concept and then later licensed it to the NISCO, which now is DuPont, Charlotte can certainly tell you. Okay, there's been a number of things have been said about prebiotics this morning. So, well, we were saying, I'm always saying that I'm from prebiotic country. Why am I from prebiotic country? There's two people who defined prebiotics only in 1995, and one was Glenn Gibson here from Reading, and his colleague Marcel Robert-Froid from Louvain-la-Neuve, our sister university in Belgium. So they were, in 1995, they defined the concept of prebiotic, and then they refined their criteria in 2004. But actually, the concept is only from 1995. They have different criteria. What is a prebiotic? It's a compound which resists gastric acidity, which is not hydrolyzed by our own enzymes, no gastrointestinal absorption, therefore it arrives in our colon. What does it do there? Well, it is fermented by intestinal microflora, and it does a selective stimulation of the growth and or activity of intestinal bacteria. And here's a very important word, associated. It doesn't say proven to be beneficial. It says associated with health and well-being. And a lot of work has been done on inulin and fructooligosaccharides. So for us it was evident to also look into what can we do here. Can we make oligosaccharides from arabinoxylan, which are also prebiotic? So again, what we're doing is we build structures, cut arabinoxylan into small pieces that still would have some of these structures. And we did massive amounts of work on this. And we started from wheat bran, and we started in Lindemans Brewery. Lindemans Brewery makes lambic beers. By their own production methods, they cannot brew between April and October, which for us was fortuitous, because then we could use their brewery. And the brewery is, it's a bioreactor. So We take wheat bran, we took the starch out, the protein out, we took xylanase, we had wheat bran axos, and we had wheat bran axos. And then what we did, so actually we have xylanase technology making these axles. And yes, we did a lot of work with human volunteers, with all sorts of experiments. In essence, resistance to gastric acidity, fermentation by intestinal microflora, selective stimulation of bifidobacteria. Axos meets all of these criteria. So Axos can be regarded as a novel prebiotic. It meets all these criteria. Yesterday evening in the restaurant there was a question as to can we use these xylanases in food products and then generate in situ? Well, what we did is we worked on xylanase technology to make these prebiotics in situ, but you have to do it right. This is an old picture from Barry McCleary, whom some of us know very well here. If you do excessive hydrolysis of with the wrong enzymes of arabinoxylane, you lose your bread structure. What we have been able to do with Piratos as one of our partners is to take wheat flour bread. It has with xylanase you can go up to 0.9% of these axos, but if you add like something like rye bran, we can still have a nice bread and increase the axos concentration. So we can, by using in situ enzyme technology, and bread making is a fantastic process because you have all this fermentation, you have dough kneading, and you have this fermentation which takes 1-2 hours at 30 degrees C, which for many enzymes is a blessing. So your conditions for bread making really allow this. So this whole development was the foundation of a spin-out, and the spin-out was called Fugea. And Fugea was founded in 2008, and we raised substantial amounts of money to further explore into this technology. And in those days, we did not know what we know today, and that is that EFSA, and I think EFSA was completely right. If I would have been on their panel and with their guidelines, I would have come to the same conclusion. When EFSA analyzed all the inulin claims, they, and it was discussed this morning, essentially, in the case of inulin, their conclusion was, yes, you have successfully demonstrated that bifidobacteria are stimulated. Congratulations. So what? Why should I give you a health claim? What does it mean that you increase your bifidobacteria? So based on those things, we, while we already had a novel food dossier, we never entered into the EFSA claim because we were looking at what they were going to decide on inulin, and we were going to run into exactly the same problem. So what we did is we transferred all this IP to Cargill, and it remains to be seen if and when Cargill will be on the market with this development. So it has been a nice experience, this whole thing, because just bilateral contract, licensing, patenting, and then a spin out. So we have a diversity of experiences in this whole domain. I'm a little behind schedule, but not too much. I started too late. Wheat flour functionality in bread making depends certainly on the milling process, Mr. Stenström, you know that. Starch, protein, on starch polysaccharides, lipids also, but I didn't document on that. And appropriate enzyme and additive technologies can contribute to bread organoleptic and nutritional properties. Thank you.
I will just do the same as Lennart did. I will give a short overview of what Jan has talked about, and he's gone through the bread making process, that I think is fairly well known, and you talked about the flour components. You talked about the importance of arabinosilans, especially unextractable arabinosilans when it comes to bread volume. Not so much about the extractable arabinosilans. It came maybe at the end a little bit about Axos. You talked about the importance of enzymes, and I think that's a very big discovery that we have so many different enzymes, and you have to make the right mixture if you should make good products, and you have to adapt that to the system you're working with. And when it comes to these components, I also think it's important because we have so many different processes, and for the different processes we need the right mixture of proteins and starch and so on in the system. And you have talked about arabinosilin inhibitors. That is a completely new area, which they have developed very much in Leuven, and I think it's really something new that has been of very big importance for the whole enzyme industry in baking and in other applications. And then you ended up with prebiotics that you think was partly a failure because you couldn't get the health claim, but I think you've done a lot of very important contribution to the field because the knowledge is there, and the important thing with all this health claim is the relevance. I mean, and relevance means health effects that you can measure and that we really know something about, and that's what is most important. We have a lot of health claims that don't have so much relevance, and I think that's a big problem for the future. So what do you think about these enzymes as additives in the future? Do you think they will develop further? Or does people, I mean, they are not declared, so they are not additives, I know that, but still it's a component that you add to your food.
Well, I think one of the major assets of, and I will be careful here, of most of these enzymes, not all, is that, and again, I refer to the baking process as something very interesting, baking for enzymes. They're active, but they're albumin proteins, so you expect most of them, if not all, but not all, to be denatured during the baking phase. So then you have a denatured protein. You know, in some of the enzyme systems, honestly, if you take a slice of bread and you take the slice of bread and you bring it in under particular conditions, you will see that the control behaves differently. You put a slice of bread in water with some enzymes at the right temperature. With some enzymes, you will see further action. With other enzymes, you will see that they have been completely denatured. So your slice of bread will, after a day, look the same in both experiments. So, but the main thing is that it's just denatured albumin protein. So, you know, like egg albumin or whatever. So that's a major thing. The other thing is that enzymes, of course, are added in minute quantities. You need only very low levels. So I think enzymes are certainly the way to go. It's a matter of communicating correctly about them, and maybe one of the areas where I expect a lot from in the next 5 to 10 years is the whole area. It's picking up in the States, but like sprouted grains, you know, partially sprouted grains, that resonates well with the consumer. Consumer accepts that, and there's enzyme development there. So I think, well, even for the more critical consumer, one should have solutions in terms of good foodstuffs and good quality.
Thank you again for a very excellent presentation.
Thank you.